if anyone has any questions, feel free to add them to the chat box, and we will try to answer them as we go. But I just wanted to say thank you very much for joining our first webinar in the Knowledge Mobilization series for Global Water Futures. We've titled this Make Research Impact, the Value of Knowledge Mobilization. And it's actually presented by the entire Knowledge Mobilization team from Global Water Futures. Before we get started, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping topics. Today's webinar is going to be recorded. We will be able to share this link with you once the event is complete, and we will welcome you to revisit the content at any time and share it with your colleagues who may also be interested. We also invite your comments and your questions, so please look at the question and answer chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you think that you have a question for any of us speakers at any time, please feel free to add your question there, and we'll decide whether or not it makes sense to interrupt our talk and answer that question immediately, or if it should be held till the end. I'm also going to ask that you mute your lines throughout the conference so that it's easier to stay focused on the presentation itself. If you do not mute your line and we're noticing some background noise, we may mute it on your behalf. So at that time, you'll have to use the chat box if you have any questions, or we'll try to keep an eye on that and unmute you. Kind of depends on how many people join us to see how we should be managing this. So, and then there's also an option for you to share your video. I will leave that as your choice. You can click on that button if you'd like to share a video, but you do not need to. So feel free to make that option yourself. So today's presenters are myself and Stephanie Merrill. Stephanie Merrill is the Knowledge Mobilization Specialist at the University of Saskatchewan. She comes from a long background, lots of expertise, particularly in water policy from an environmental NGO perspective. She has over 10 years of experience, primarily in New Brunswick, where she was a very well sought after expert, appointed to various provincial panels and discussions. So we're very lucky to have her. My name is Nancy Gaucher, and I am the Knowledge Mobilization Specialist for Global Water Futures at the Water Institute at the University of Waterloo. I also have about 10 years of water policy experience, likewise similar to Stephanie in the nonprofit environmental policy world. My first 5 years was really spent working on more national water policy issues, and then for the last 5 years, I've been very focused on what's happening specifically in the Great Lakes, including working for a US-based NGO, trying to bring together perspectives from both sides of the border. So it's important to understand sort of our background because we kind of come from, we were sitting at some of the decision-making tables where we think that the research that's being done at each of our institutions could have a lot of influence. So with that, I also wanted to just quickly mention that we're going to put out a survey at the end of this webinar. It may come out later today or maybe on Monday. We just wanted to get your thoughts and your opinions about how the webinar went. So please stay tuned for that. So without further ado, I may ask my colleague Stephanie to step in and begin the content of the webinar. Once again, if anyone has questions, please feel free to add those to the chat box, and we're going to try to tag team and answer these questions for you as we go.
Great. Thanks, Nancy. I think we have a few people joining us from outside of the Global Water Futures program, so I just have a couple of slides that introduces this program for people who aren't familiar. So Global Water Futures, we're in the second year of research of this pan-Canadian network that is a partnership between the University of Saskatchewan, McMaster University, Waterloo, and Wilfrid Laurier. It is funded by a number of sources, but primarily CFREF, which is the federal government tri-council funding, valued at about $78 million from that source over 7 years. So it's a big undertaking in terms of climate and water research in Canada. We've got about 152 researchers based at many universities as partners in this work. And we're growing in partnerships with NGOs, industry associations, government agencies, to the tune of about 350 individual organizations and partners currently. So at the end of this 7 years, we hope to be able to deliver some very timely risk management solutions for these very challenging water futures that we are undergoing as we experience this rapidly changing landscape and environments under new climate scenarios that are seeming to be increasing at an increasingly rapid rate. So a lot of urgency here and timing for this research. Specifically, the projects are very diverse. We're up to 42 now under a few different types of research umbrellas. But most specific to knowledge mobilization, we have 12 projects that have a very strong mandate to create research, co-create research with partners and end users specific to creating solutions that are more, at the end of the project, readily available for uptake and impact. And then 8 projects that are just coming online, specific to working with and on water issues specifically related to community, indigenous communities and processes and methods that are more specific to them. So inherently built into Global Water Futures across the board is this goal of knowledge mobilization, and as I mentioned, it's very central to many of these projects. And we've defined knowledge mobilization as the ability to mobilize the knowledge for the benefit of society and the economy. And so really this is about translating new information that's co-created from experts, whether that be scientific experts or experts on the ground or in agencies making decisions about water and climate into that pipeline of being taken up in decision making. So last May, we had our first annual science meeting as a network in Hamilton. And the knowledge mobilization team did a quick little bit of polling to kind of get a sense of where our network is at in terms of their understanding and comfort level with knowledge mobilization. And so really the take-home message here is that about 70% of the folks who participated in this meeting and this poll specifically feel like they could still use some help. I think across the board in terms of what is knowledge mobilization, understanding what it is through to how do I do it, and then how do I know if it's successful. So that's kind of the impetus for the knowledge mobilization team putting together this webinar series to try and provide some training and capacity building across the network to address those needs of our researchers and research staff and research teams. So we're hosting this series. Today is our inaugural webinar, so thanks for joining us, and we hope that you come back for some more. Primarily, our audience here is researchers and students and staff who are part of the GWF network, but we know that we've had interest beyond those borders, which we think is fantastic. So we welcome everybody who's interested in learning more about this practice of knowledge mobilization. We really want to try to be interactive and have discussions and have those discussions and the themes that we've chosen be informed by the needs of you guys. So we hope that you participate. And we're going to continue this for about 6 months. We have a different theme chosen for the next 6 months. which is based on kind of our interactions with researchers and the network and our sense of what people might be interested in. But after that, we are absolutely open to hearing thoughts on themes for the future, or how we might incorporate some of your successes, if you've got some, or some of your challenges into the upcoming themes as some good case studies. So please be in touch about that. Through this series, we hope to kind of accomplish some high-level things, increase the awareness and the value and implementation of knowledge mobilization. We recognize that there's kind of many floating definitions of what knowledge mobilization is and different ways of approaching it, and we feel like we still need to do some work to kind of get everybody on similar pages. So we hope to help to do that. We want to do that through sharing some stories and some examples of successful initiatives that are either happening within projects that we're already observing and helping with, or much broader across work that Nancy and I and our colleagues Stephanie and Andrew have experience with. And then through all this, build a community of practice. So we want you to become experts in knowledge mobilization, and we want to be able to build a group of people who can kind of come together fairly regularly, identify challenges and successes, and you know, kind of troubleshoot as a team effort, because that sometimes breaks down the barriers and from people feeling overwhelmed from attacking a new topic. So this is where we're going to try and do a little bit of interaction. We've got some polls. We're trying this for the first time in a webinar setting, so hopefully it works. Bear with us if we have technical difficulties, but I'm confident. So you have two options. Nancy gave you the browser where you can click the answers to the question, or if you've registered using your mobile phone to the number 37607, then as soon as I put up the poll, you'll be able to send your A, B, C, D responses through that. So here we go. Are you GWF affiliated? Yes or no? And don't worry, we're not going to boot you out of the webinar if you're not. We're just kind of getting a sense of who's listening, and you know, this is kind of one of first steps, kind of best practices in knowledge mobilization that we'll touch on a little bit later, but we like to practice what we preach, and so we just want to get a sense of who our audience is and who we're talking to. So it looks like we've got you know, a good chunk of folks are researchers or students or staff with Global Water Futures, and then a handful of people joining us from outside, so welcome. Which institution are you affiliated with? And if you're not with one of those GWF partner groups, then hopefully you find identity in one of the others. Look at Waterloo representing. Nancy must have got out the vote.
I just voted 20 times. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay, great. That's great. I'm really happy to see everybody, all of our learners joining us today. What is your main role in your job or your position at your institution? We just kind of want to see who, you know, who's taking up the opportunities to engage in capacity building, and you know, different tools for different people and different interests. So just getting a sense of who you guys are. So we've got some management and research staff, and lots of graduate students and economics, non-academic staff. We don't have any principal investigators yet. We'll have to work on that. And what is your primary discipline that you kind of identify your research or your you know, your role at your institution? I love seeing it morph in real time. lots of biophysical sciences, which is not overly surprising, and kind of a straight across the board of everybody else. Oh. Great. Okay, well that gives us a great sense. So we're going to spend the rest of today getting into some of the kind of high level thoughts on what is knowledge mobilization and why is it important? What is the value that knowledge mobilization brings to your research agenda? We're going to get into some tips for optimizing success of knowledge mobilization. Hopefully you feel like those are tangible. And then we're going to, through some storytelling and examples, hope to highlight those practical benefits that your research can have through a process of knowledge mobilization, but also you as individuals in terms of professional development and also personal development. So now I'm going to take over from here.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. So we're going to do another quick poll here. We want to ask you to rank on sort of a scale from negligible influence to direct influence. How much influence do you think academic research has on decision making? How much does it currently have? And I know this is pretty tough because the answer is probably it depends, but we're looking for you to make a decision in terms of, on average, how often do you think our decision makers are turning to academics for input? Give it just a couple seconds and we'll see where we land. I'm also going to say decision making is very broad in this context. We're talking about influence on policy, on technical processes, on community decision making. Very broad. Seems like we're slowing down in terms of changes. So it is very interesting. I mean, the large majority says it's closer to the weaker side, and no one has indicated direct influence, which is also interesting. I think this is very important because what we're trying to argue or discuss is the need to improve that. We need these numbers to possibly go towards stronger influence rather than the other end of the spectrum. So Stephanie and I, like I had said before, we come from an NGO background where we were, often on the front lines of decision making, sitting at those tables where people were discussing and shaping water policy in Canada. And based on some of the observations and discussions that we've been having, I think that there's been a lot of missed opportunities in the Canadian context for researchers to have more influence. And from a very personal perspective, that's why I joined this job. That's why I took this position. Oh, can we just ask people to mute themselves, or maybe Stephanie can go through
and then I just added a little bit after.
People that might be talking. Sorry. So, from a very personal perspective, I think that, that's why I'm here, because I feel like there is more potential for research academics to be involved.
I forgot my...
Are you figuring out the muting options? Yeah? Okay.
I got everybody muted now.
Okay. It's one of those things. You can't run a webinar without someone in the background awkwardly commenting, but not commenting on the discussion that's actually happening. Anyway, so, I wanted to bring up a couple examples from my own personal experience. It's no surprise that Lake Erie is facing a whole bunch of problems in terms of water quality, specifically with respect to harmful algal blooms. And many of you probably know that Canada and Ontario have been working together over the last few years to set targets for phosphorus reduction and to also create action plans see what kinds of things we're going to be doing on the landscape, what kind of decisions are we going to be making in order to try to reach those phosphorus reduction targets. And I was very involved in that entire process for the last number of years. You know, and one of the things that I was constantly observing in the process, especially during the development of the action plan, was that the academic researchers, of which I have kind of grown to learn, is that there are a lot of people who are looking at these issues. You know, they weren't necessarily at those tables. So for instance, when Canada and Ontario brought out their draft action plan for comment, they did a lot of public consultation, and they held in-person tables with 4 different sectors, with the municipalities, with the conservation authorities, with the Indigenous organizations, and finally with the nonprofit environmental organization sector. And I thought it was interesting that there was no consultation specifically set aside for academic researchers. And you know, there's a number of reasons for that, and in part it's because I think that they were incorporating some science along the way with the scientists that are located within the government departments. They were also working with some scientists during their working group sessions. So it's called the Annex 4 working groups. And you know, there would probably have been some input from scientists at that stage. But I did think it was interesting that when it came down to finalizing the policies, the people who have there's a lot of people who have things to say about that were not at those tables. It's just a clear example to me of where there's missed opportunity and opportunities to take greater advantage in order to make sure that the great ideas that you guys are coming up with are making its way to impact. Another example from my experience, I worked on trying to advocate for the passage and the strengthening of the Ontario's Great Lakes Protection Act. This is a piece of legislation that was passed in, I believe, 2014, hard to remember, because it was actually a number of years in the making. It was very sort of interesting to follow along with this piece of legislation because it was introduced, it died on the table, it was reintroduced, there was different governments in power throughout the Great Lakes Protection Act. Basically, it's a piece of legislation that creates opportunities to set targets, to create action plans on any sort of issue that's being faced at a watershed level, and to also create solutions for specific geographical areas that might just address sort of that local problem. But once again, you know, I was involved in this for a number of years. There was very few researchers that engaged. I mean, there were a few, and you know, credit to give to people like Gail Krantzberg who were at the table. But you know, when it came down to presenting at the steering committees, giving their ideas about how to strengthen it, you know, writing submissions. I actually went to the government, read all the submissions that were sent in. Very few were from researchers. So once again, just kind of another example where I think that there's opportunity for us to be more engaged, to be at the table, to make sure that the policies that we are writing in Ontario and Canada and across, you know, across the spectrum are based in science, are informed by science, and are responding to some of the threats and issues that our scientists are identifying. So we'll move on. I wanted to open this up a little bit, so maybe I'll ask Stephanie to unmute some lines at this point. I wanted to ask you guys, what do you think are some of the reasons why academics aren't having as much impact as they could? And you can either choose to speak up, you can choose to raise your hand, and we'll try to identify that. You can also enter your thoughts into the chat box. So hopefully with the combination of options, we're going to get lots of feedback. If there's background noise, we may close your line back up again, and you might need to use the chat box. thoughts? I mean, you know, Stephanie and I were brainstorming some ideas before the webinar began. You know, we were thinking, is it because people are too busy? Thank you, Krisha. Is it because, you know, is it difficult? Do people not understand how do you actually go about doing this? Are there other priorities? You know, we're looking for pretty high-level thoughts.
Does anybody have any personal experiences with some of those barriers? Any examples of opportunities that you felt like you could contribute but didn't in the end, and what were some of those reasons? And also, right.
Could I ask you to speak up and explain a little bit, what kind of tools do you think would be needed?
Anna doesn't want to speak to it.
Okay, you meaning you don't know how? Okay, that's clear. Okay, no worries, Anna. Sarah.
Maria,
Stephanie, I can hardly hear you because of the background noise. Perhaps you could mute some of the. Can you see which ones are the noisy ones?
No.
People seem to want to use the chat box anyway, so maybe we can mute the lines just so that we can clearly hear. So, yes, Krisha says time constraints, risk to reputation. I think that's an interesting one. Not having the right tools, meaning not quite sure how. The lack of planning before research begins in terms of how they're going to actually use the results. Bureaucracy. That's interesting. Are you able to expand on that? So do you mean it's difficult to figure out how to navigate the bureaucracy, that you don't understand how it works? Or is it just maybe it feels like a barrier, or maybe there's something else? I'm trying to guess what you mean there. And then Jess was saying academics might not be incorporating stakeholders into the design stage of their research projects, so results are mismatched with the needs. I think that's a really critical observation. It's common for scientists to have difficulty communicating to the layperson. Fair enough. And normally academics are too embedded within their own bubble, or they don't even know how to translate their findings to policymakers. Those are very astute observations, and I don't want to speak for Stephanie, but I'm not necessarily surprised at any of these results. I think these are things that we've been hearing, and without going too far into detail at this point, because we're going to have more to add later on, I'll just say that, you know, these are things that are very real and they're happening, and that's why we were hired. That's why Stephanie Merrill and I, and Stephanie Morningstar and Andrew Spring at Mac and Laurier are here, because we have experience doing these things, communicating to the layperson, understanding how to navigate bureaucracy, understanding the context outside of the bubble of research. So I'll just keep chugging along. Stephanie is tipping me off to do that by moving the slides. So the way that we have set this up is we've sort of identified a number of tips for you. We would love to be able to provide a really nice framework or step-by-step process and say, this is how you do knowledge mobilization. But the truth is, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, and it's not necessarily the same for everyone. So every person researching something different, the nature of research changes, what we're trying to actually influence or impact changes. And so there is no formula that can be given and seen as a path to success every time. The way that I think it's been helpful for me to think about this, and I hope it helps you as well, is to think about it as, you know, knowledge mobilization is about trying lots of different things, you know, pushing on various doors, talking to lots of different people in order to increase your chances of having success, of ensuring that the ideas that you're coming up with land with the right people, resonate. So, you know, it's not just about ticking off boxes. You know, this has been a difficult thing for us to think through as knowledge mobilization staff at Global Water Futures because, you know, you're trying to take all of the research that's being done and evaluate it and say, did they do knowledge mobilization or not? And there is, like, you can't come up with, you know, 10, 20 boxes and kind of tick it and say yes, no, because it's a little bit more complicated than that. And even if you do tick off all the boxes, that doesn't actually mean, it might not actually mean that your research has had impact. And vice versa, just if you're not ticking off those boxes that we've identified, you might still have impact. But so, you know, this really is just a bit of a continual process of engaging, of trying, of working with people, and hopefully we'll end up with some opportunities and some success. But at the same time, I don't want to leave it to it's not all opportunistic. There are things that we can actually do. So we'll skip to the next slide. So there's, like we had said, you know, there's no specific framework that really kind of makes sense to all at all times, but in order to help explain what I think some of the objectives of knowledge mobilization are, I think that this relatively simple kind of diagram might help. So what I think this diagram emphasizes is a few things. You know, first, it's really important for researchers to engage with the end users right from the very beginning. End users are sort of in a world of, they sort of live in the world of impact, right? And so they can provide insights into what's happening at that time. They can tell you what kinds of discussions are happening, what kinds of questions do they have, where are there opportunities to have influence, who else should be involved in those conversations. That's the world they live in. You know, someone had said before, researchers are in their own bubble. You know, end users are in a bubble too. They're just in a different bubble. So you can sort of glance into that by talking to those people, by talking to the end users. And the other thing that's really important is that knowledge mobilization doesn't just end with communicating your results well. You know, even if you did a really good job of taking the information that you have and boiling it down to what it means, putting it in an infographic, writing a great article that's in a magazine, a blog, you know, even being on the news, that's all great and that's all really important and part of knowledge mobilization, but it doesn't end there. You know, you might kind of, as we say, hit a brick wall if you don't talk about how does your results of your research actually land. So I will have an example in the next slide, but before I go there, one last piece of this is to acknowledge that this is cyclical. So if your research can have impact, it's important to think through to the next stage and figure out how does that impact, how does what's happening in the real world sort of influence the next stage of research so that we are continuously improving and moving forward, you know, as similar to adaptive management. we'll just move forward. I'll just bring up one quick example from my own personal background and experience working on a campaign around microbeads. I worked in Ontario with MPP Marie-France Lalonde, and in the federal government I was working with the environment critic Megan Leslie to advocate for solutions for legislative solutions around all of this sort of microbeads that we were finding in freshwater systems. So if you think back to kind of what the role of the researcher was in this process of banning microbeads in Canada, the story sort of begins with, there was a number of researchers, but I think one of the key ones is Dr. Sherry Mason from SUNY University in New York. And she actually partnered with an NGO called Five Gyres Institute, and that was an NGO very focused on plastic pollution and the gyres in the ocean. And they realized that in order to try to move forward on plastic pollution, they should also be looking at if this problem exists in freshwater systems. So they worked with Dr. Sherry Mason to do a number of surveys of the Great Lakes in order to identify the levels of plastic pollution. Those surveys were carried out from 2012 to 2014, at least the first ones, and I know she's been working on this issue since. Some of their results found that there was up to 450,000 plastic particles per square kilometer in Lake Erie. And this news sort of hit home once the public started finding out about it. They really wanted action. But part of that process of understanding what this research meant was communicating it well. And, I know that Dr. Sherry Mason presented at meetings and conferences and workshops, so I saw her, a number of times. I know that she was talking to the media, the New York Times, she was doing TED Talks, she was out there communicating her results really well. But she went a little bit above and beyond that to actually be discussing the need for legislative solutions. And I think the other sort of, and you probably know that the end result of this story is that Canada has banned microbeads, and I believe that the ban on import and export began January of this year, and there will be no sales of microbeads by summer next year, I believe. So it was a pretty quick example of how research has quickly moved to having impact. And there's a number of different factors that were involved, including collaboration with a lot of other NGOs and media outlets and other researchers, and we were able to kind of create change relatively quickly. So I think we pass it off to Stephanie again.
Great. Thanks, Nancy, for those really tangible examples from your experience. We're going to continue on talking about this idea of optimizing success, that knowledge mobilization is a process to help you do that. And one of the first things after you kind of become open to being opportunistic to potential impact, identifying what the potential opportunities are around you is our tip number 2. And it's important to know that there are lots of different kind of scales of impact, and Nancy gave us a couple of examples of fairly high-level impact, impacting and influencing federal or regional government policy. Another example of that would be, major science influence on the Fisheries Act, which we all know got a lot of gutting, so to speak, a few years ago, and the science community really rallied around making that a priority for improving, closing those holes, but also actually improving in a new iteration of that act, which is currently being worked on. So those are really high-level impacts, but we don't want you to think that you always have to shoot for that kind of gold star, if you will, that there's lots of scales, and that includes very tangible community-based or watershed-based impacts like helping to set water quality objectives for a watershed management plan. Perhaps your research has helped to identify areas of a watershed where objectives need to be specific to naturally occurring conditions, or need to reflect the current context of the existing land use activities that are happening there. So you have a real opportunity to help a watershed association or a regional government identify what those appropriate objectives for water quality or quantity might be. We have a lot of community-based behavior change. We have good examples like mercury research in the north that has contributed to changes in community-level behaviors around consumption of fish based on a new understanding of bioaccumulation. That could also then translate into regional government changes or Health Canada standards or guideline changes for human health, things like that. Also knowledge mobilization can help inform and improve processes. A lot of biomonitoring assessments like the wastewater effluent regulations at the federal level or a CCME guideline for water quality. These all are backstopped by a scientific understanding of protocols and how do we use environmental DNA to do rapid bioassessments of biodiversity of a river or a lake. And so we have researchers who are working on nailing down the methodology that's needed before an official entity like a government regulator can adopt those processes and put them into a legal framework where then, when potentially go to court, they've got that scientific rigor to backstop the methodology that they've put into law. So there's lots of different scales of impact, and really there is no short opportunity to have that impact. You just need to look around. And one of the ways of doing that is by doing a bit of a surveillance of the environment. So tip number 3 is really about trying to understand the context in which you're trying to make this change. And I fundamentally believe that this is essentially the crux of knowledge mobilization. You can't know this stuff on day one. This is about building relationships, building a sense, building a spidey sense of what's going on around you in terms of, social responses to environmental issues. Climate change is a really good example of a very diverse response. So kind of understanding what are reactions, what are government agendas, what are their mandates, and their political cycles and the timing in order to slide something in at the right time that it is seen as useful and timely for their process. Really it's following these issues in the media and with NGOs who are typically quite well informed on kind of the goings-on, if you will, of environmental policy needs, and can really help identify the scientific inputs that are needed for those processes. We kind of call NGOs boundary organizations in kind of the knowledge mobilization lingo. Because they often have done this kind of environmental surveillance and can help us identify, be a bit of a bridge between being in our academic or our scientific silos and reaching that other side of the brick wall that Nancy showed us. So really it's about being open, being opportunistic, expect the unexpected, really try to anticipate opportunities. This is difficult when it's not seen as your primary job. I think Nancy and I have been fortunate in our past lives is that working in NGOs, oftentimes this is your job to kind of surveillance of the environment and be opportunistic. And we're trying to create a bit of a culture shift here with academia. So I can completely appreciate and understand that people feel like this is kind of an added task to their plate and that perhaps it's not their jobs to do it, somebody else's job. But we would argue that, you know, being the experts of your field, that you are really the best poised to build those relationships and have that direct impact. So the irony here of this next slide is that we've just told you that it's about being opportunistic and look, you know, expect the unexpected, but we want you to plan for that. You know, knowledge mobilization is opportunistic, and, you know, an opportunity might rear its head tomorrow that you might feel is a, you know, can't let it pass because the impact potential is just too great. And that's great. I would say a lot of knowledge mobilization happens that way. But we really want to get you guys to think a little bit more systematically about knowledge mobilization and be planning for it from day one. That's why we've built in some requirements through Global Water Futures to develop a knowledge mobilization strategy or plan where you think through, you know, what are the short, medium, and long-term goals or outputs that we want to get through this. And I've on the screen showed you an example of a logic model that I developed for one of the projects specific to Global Water Futures. And it was just really about taking the proposal and the ideas that this group of researchers had and really breaking it down into the steps. At the end of the day, they want, you know, improved environmental or water quality. Well, I think we all can agree to that. So let's work backwards from there. What are the steps that we need to identify? What are the, you know, the targets and the people that we need to bring into that conversation, and what are the inputs in terms of resources that are needed to get there? So really, once you kind of do this thinking, you can start to work backwards to identify the strategies or the tactics that you might need to operationalize your intended outcomes. So doing a logic model is a pretty simple undertaking. I know folks are really reticent to do more planning and more laying out, and that sometimes it feels like you know, a make work task. But it's really, really useful visualization to see the big kind of, you know, the big points in the spectrum in the process or the pathway that you need. It can be also a really good way to check in on your progress and to help evaluate your success. So speaking of evaluating your success, everybody wants to know, how do we know if we're successful in knowledge mobilization? And of course, there's like, you know, a couple of really big obvious things, like, has your research had impact? Has there been a policy change? Has there been a very specific behavior change in a community or in a regulation or a regulatory process? Those are, I think, the nuggets that everybody is looking for, but I also want to reiterate that process can also be a success. And so this is often kind of a shorter term success until those impacts can be achieved, because as Nancy said, it could be years of policy development before you see that new act being tabled in the legislature or that new source water protection plan being presented to the community. But that doesn't mean that there's not steps along the way that you can have impact on, and you can claim that as success. And so we've got a few indicators here that we've been working on, and it's really about kind of understanding how your relationships with your partners has been incorporated into your research. That's the relationship building component of knowledge mobilization. So are you providing mechanisms for your partners to stay engaged? Are you taking their feedback seriously? Is it becoming incorporated into the research design or the makeup or the language or the the products that you're developing? Do they feel like that's a valued contribution that they're making, or does it feel token? Does it feel like, yeah, thanks for that, we'll carry on anyways? You know, once you start asking your partners and collaborators, you will very quickly know whether or not you're being successful. And I think that's a very key step in evaluating your success, is having that discussion. How do the people that you are trying to build this research with for these co-designed solutions, how are they feeling about their role in the research, and whether or not it is actually effective and useful for them in their decision making or their on-the-ground implementation work. So don't be afraid to ask them. We can feel afraid to ask because we're maybe nervous about the response, but that's the only way we're really going to you know, learn and get better at knowledge mobilization, is taking that feedback seriously. Okay, Nancy. You're muted.
Sorry. I was trying to follow my own rules because I told everyone to mute themselves. So the final tip that we sort of wanted to bring to your attention is it's a little bit more of an acknowledgement that as you learn how to do knowledge mobilization, you're building your own skill set. You know, this is not stuff this is not stuff you learn. These aren't skills that you learn just for this specific research project that you're working on. If you learn how to do knowledge mobilization, you're going to build your skill set, whether or not you're remaining in the university academic setting, if you're going out and getting a job at an engineering firm, within government, within an NGO, wherever you sort of land, these are skills that are going to be really important to you. So that's sort of an added benefit. You know, one of the things is, one easy sort of advantage of doing knowledge mobilization well is that you can explain the significance of your research and articulate that in a way that's going to resonate for the people reading your research applications. Whether you're applying to SSHRC, NSERC, CFREF, you know, those large research initiatives want to see that you understand how to create impact. And a solid KM plan and having that experience is going to improve your ability to do that. It's also about soft skill development. You know, we talked a lot about, you know, KM is about getting out there, talking to people, you know, learning how to be a leader in your own discipline, but also in your community. It's about learning how to network, how to actually talk to people, and this is not easy stuff, and this isn't stuff that I knew right away either. And I'm not a scientist, I'm not a hard scientist, and yet it's kind of not something that's easy to anyone, and you really just need to kind of go out there and practice. And if you're ever sitting down with me, I will tell you all my stories of failures with networking, which I find hilarious now. But, you know, this is also, it's just a story, you know, it's about professional development. You know, if you're out there telling people in a way that makes sense to them about how this research could have impact, that's building your own reputation as a researcher that is trustworthy, is collaborative, can be counted on. You know, the truth is that a lot of these people who are trying to influence, a lot of the policymakers, decision makers, those people are not sitting in their offices reading journal articles. You know, sometimes they're not even reading the industry magazines. Sometimes, you know, they're not even reading full blogs or websites. Where people get a lot of their information is from people they know. When you're really busy and you don't have time, what you do is you pick up the phone, or you send an email, and you talk to people you know. So one of the goals is really to just be on the speed dial of some of these people so that they call you. And when that's your name on that speed dial, that's your reputation. And you can quickly build a reputation, get asked to join panels. That is a really important part of career development. And I think that those types of skills are being recognized by universities as well. So if you decide to stay in academia, you know, those are the kind of tick marks that they're looking for when they're deciding tenure and various awards that are really going to be helpful. So we're trying to make this resonate to you too. There's even more of a reason, even if you feel like there might not, you know, that you have your own kind of world and you've got to work on that, to be doing well at your job means to expand your skills and to think about knowledge mobilization and incorporate that into the work that you're doing on a daily basis. So we're nearing the end, and just wanted to do just a really quick recap of these tips that we've given you. Once again, you don't need to write this down because we can give you the slide deck, but you know, knowledge mobilization is about taking advantage of opportunities, knocking on those doors, increasing your chances of success. It's about identifying opportunities for impact, like what are you actually trying to achieve so that you can start developing your strategies to head in that direction. And impact can be defined very broadly. You have to understand the context in which you're trying to make change. You need to understand, if you're trying to make policy change, you need to at least have a sense of what laws exist. What are they already doing? Because you need to be able to build on that or argue why it's not working properly. So it's going to help for you to understand that context. And as we had described, you know, identifying a pathway to achieve those outcomes, working backwards from where you know you want to be. And then also adopting a very iterative process. This is about learning as we go. This is about muddling your way through. And finally, recognize the opportunity to use KM to expand your own professional development and your own ability to be a leader in your community making these changes. So once again, I think Stephanie and I have been saying this throughout the webinar, but we want to make sure that you know that we are here. We have lots of different experience that can be helpful, and we actually want to. When I sit down with students and they tell me what I'm doing, what they're doing, and I'm so excited because I can be like, well, you should be talking to this person, or you should be looking at this policy that's already been written, or you should build on this. And I think, you know, that kind of level of interaction is where real movement can happen. So we really want you to be knocking on our doors, sending us emails, having those conversations. We're very happy to do that. And this is just a list of some of the things that we can do, but you know, sometimes it just takes a conversation, just a really casual conversation to get the ball rolling. So we welcome that initiation from you. And it's everyone. We're inviting, you know, GWF staff of all and researchers of all levels. And at the University of Waterloo, I'm also available to assist other projects as well. So with that, we hope we've sold you on this idea that the webinar series could be helpful for you. And if so, we invite you to join our subsequent webinars. You can find a list here that we hope you put in your calendar. They're going to always be at noon Saskatchewan time and 2 p.m. in Ontario, and last about an hour and a half. So you can set that time aside in your calendar. And you know, the important thing here is, like, we couldn't just do this in one webinar. We wanted to give you like the tidbits of knowledge mobilization in this one, tell you, kind of get you sold on, maybe this is valuable, maybe I should be thinking about this. And then we want to dive in deeper on some of these topics, you know, such as how do we actually work with our partners, and how do we keep them engaged throughout these processes, because, you know, this is a 7-year program. So that's going to be the next one on November 16th. and you can read the subsequent webinar topics, and more information will be emailed out to all of the GWF folks. If you are interested in staying connected and you're not on our GWF list, maybe you can put your email address in the chat box, and we'll make sure that you get invites to subsequent webinars. Great. And I think at this point we might open it up to discussion, questions, and in that list, while you're asking questions, let us know if you think there's any other topics that you want to see us cover. Do you have questions that you're coming across that you think might be valuable for the entire network to hear? We'd really like to hear, what are the things you're struggling with in order to figure out the best way of helping us move forward, because we're learning how to do this as well as we go. So it would be helpful to hear that. Or if you have questions of clarification, if you have stories of success, if you have stories of challenges, I'm going to open it up at this point to hear what you guys have to say.
Nancy Maria had a question in the chat that was related to kind of the professional and personal development, and the question was around how the incentives for tenure and awards, and most of that list was kind of geared around investigators and maybe existing, faculty and stuff, but undergrads and grad students, she says, can't put this on their resume to apply for jobs, so they probably wouldn't be interested in this strategy, right?
Well, I guess what I would say is you probably won't put knowledge mobilization skills, list that as your resume, on your resume, but you might start to, okay, so I went to a conference this week, and I was talking to a president of a water tech company, and he said that he's afraid to hire PhD students because he's afraid that they're too narrowly focused on their very specific area of research and might not be suitable for addressing problems as they come, which are much broader than that, probably much broader than the specific area that they've studied. They're also worried about the amount of pay that these people want, or that they might just leave them sort of at a drop of a hat when an academic position comes available. So I think what we need to be doing is thinking through what are the skill sets, or how do you demonstrate that you're a type of person, student that is suitable for a work environment. And for me, that means demonstrating that you understand their world, which is, not necessarily that easy if you haven't been there. So if you want to work for a water tech company, then you've got to find ways of explaining that you understand that. Maybe you've written a blog that describes your research and its applicability to that company. Or you've said, hey, I understand how this company has done their research processes. Now I'm using my research to actually, tell them what tweaks they could make to improve that. That would be really sort of grounded, and you could point to that article. And that would be much more relevant than pointing to a journal article, which demonstrates a different set of skills that you're really able to, it's hard to get journals published, and that's really impressive, but not necessarily the things that your employers are looking for. If you wanted to get a job in government, it might be really helpful for them to know that you understand the regulatory framework that exists, that government department is using to manage water or whatever sort of area you want to get into. And then you can, explain you can put on your resume what sort of networking groups you're part of, where you've volunteered, where you've, you can use examples in your cover letter saying, in this conference, I was able to connect with people after my presentation, and we talked, And the conversation resulted in these people doing something different. I don't know. You can follow through and kind of, there's ways of providing, of demonstrating the skills that you've learned through knowledge mobilization in your resumes and cover letters and in your job interviews to show that you are thinking beyond your bubble, as we kind of have been framing it.
I would just add that I think you can very tangibly put this on your resume, and Nancy hit on it in terms of volunteering and being a part of, you know, boards, watershed associations, especially for those of you who are kind of early stage, early career scientists. That's a really good way of building your network and building your relationships and starting that ability to be able to survey the environment and understand you know, the goings-ons and the workings of these types of organizations, and that's a very tangible activity that you can add to your resume. It's beneficial in developing your knowledge mobilization skills. Do we have anybody who wants to unmute themselves and ask a question or contribute any thoughts or any examples of, you know, good knowledge mobilization activities that you've been involved with that you'd like to share with the group? Somebody break the ice. Oh, do we have somebody who unmuted themselves?
That was me.
If nobody wants to share a story or ask any questions, does anybody want to throw out ideas for future workshop topics? We've got a few planned out here, but are there things that you would like to see specifically? Oops, sorry.
One of the things I was going to say is that there's a lot of different projects that are happening across the Global Water Futures Network, so it might be cool just to have a strategy for knowledge mobilization, like within Global Water Futures, in between the annual conferences or whatever.
Okay.
So you want to, are you trying to understand what is the research that's happening across GWF for you to help involve yourself in that research? Maybe you can help inform their approaches. Do you want sort of like opportunities to integrate the things that you're working on with other researchers, or is it about networking, or what are you kind of looking for there?
I guess for me it was just sort of awareness of what else is going on. We're sort of trying to design our project, and it strikes me that there may be other people that are doing similar work or working in the similar communities, and so it just might be interesting to see what other people are doing, and then, you know, if connections happen out of that, that would be interesting. But even just having that opportunity to share, I think, is valuable, because it's odd to be like, I'm part of this group and I know there are other projects, but I don't know what they're doing really on a very specific basis.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. You know, I started in June and I'm still trying to figure out all of the different projects that are happening. It's a pretty big initiative, so I think it's kind of something we've thought about and tried to, and sort of struggled with, is how do you communicate all of the various work that's being done in an effective way that's not overwhelming to people. So thanks you for that. I think it was Sarah. It's good to know that there's interest, and we'll keep thinking about that.
Yeah, like I wasn't sure if maybe there's like a, you know, a short one-page feature each week or something of like, oh, here's, you know, some progress in one of the groups each week, or something like almost like an email newsletter or something. Yeah.
Well, maybe Stephanie can put in the chat box the link to the Global Water Futures newsletter service that we do have. So that's one thing. I know it's not your fault if you don't know about it. We're still sort of working on these things, but you should sign up, make sure that you're getting those emails. That would be at least the first thing. But I think we can do a better job of doing what you said and really featuring projects and trying to make links between that. So if anyone has any further ideas about ways to do that, we'd be really happy and excited to hear that. You're welcome to put ideas in the chat box or to email us after as well. And our emails are on the last slide if you want to turn to that, Stephanie. And I will also just quickly mention at the University of Waterloo, we're going to have some of our Global Order Future projects have a stakeholder workshop where we're going to ask our students to put together infographic posters to present their work. So that might be an idea that other institutions can steal, adapt, work with, but I think it's something we should aim towards is better communication between projects as well.